Welcome back to another episode of Written for Admonition, Studies in the Old Testament. We're picking up where we left off from our previous conversation about why God gave the law to his people. And in our previous conversation, we established the important truth that God gave his law to teach Israel what it means to be good and to do good. We established the fact that God, as the giver of the law, given that he is all good and perfect, that whatever he would give in terms of law would also reflect that value of being perfect and good. So when we look at the law of God in the Old Testament, it may strike us as strange in some places and in some situations, but remember when you're reading through that, you're reading God's divine perspective on these different issues that affect people in their lives, and this is the way that he wanted things to be in the Old Testament. And we're seeing much the same in this conversation, but in a different direction. We're talking now about how the law is meant to restrain evil. And this is something that I believe we can resonate with pretty well even today. Throughout all of human history, the reason that we've come up with laws is to restrain bad behavior. Now, you can debate the effectiveness of that. You can question whether or not there's wisdom in doing that in some cases. We're not here really to do that in terms of human laws, but just to use that as an example and an illustration of why laws exist to begin with. We want to make sure that bad behavior is not rewarded. We want to make sure that bad behavior is properly punished. And we want to make sure people understand why bad behavior is really bad. We can take things that are simple, like a speed limit, or just road laws in general. Why is it that we have a law that says the speed limit in a certain area is thus and such? There's going to be a lot of factors that go into that, but one of them is, of course, going to be safety. And if you've got people who are driving 90 miles an hour in a 45 mile per hour zone, which unfortunately does happen, that's dangerous. It puts people at risk unnecessarily. And so we have a law that says that if you do that, you are subject to punishment. You're going to have points added to your license. You're going to receive a ticket with a financial penalty. All of this is intended to keep people from speeding, from treating the road like it's their own in a negative way. And you could say that for any number of laws that are out there in this country and across this world. It is meant to restrain evil within people, to keep them from wanting to do bad things because they realize if they do those bad things, it's going to extract a cost from them. And that's certainly not something that anyone wants to have to deal with. So the law is good in that respect in that it restrains evil. That's the same way it is with the law of God in the Old Testament. But we understand that a general law in the United States is going to have a different purpose behind it in terms of what we find there and in terms of what we find in the law of God, because the stakes are a little bit higher when we talk about what happened in Israel. So we understand that God has taught through the law his people what is right and what is wrong. But we also understand he has taught through the law what will happen if they pursue evil. And the idea behind that is rooted in the covenant to which they agreed back in the book of Exodus. I know I'm going way, way back when we talked about that covenant in Exodus chapter 24, but I'm just going to ask you to bear with me for a moment as we consider that. In Exodus 24, the people of Israel and that generation coming out of Egypt, God has given to them part of his law and has told them what his expectation is. And he has set before them this covenant and has called upon them to agree to it or to reject it. And they agreed to it. But whenever you enter into a covenant with God, that is a very special relationship you are now accepting with God. And part of that is going to be that you're accepting his requirements for your life and also accepting that if you do not do what he has commanded you to do, he has the right to punish you according to what his law says. That's exactly where the restraint part comes in when we talk about the reason for the Old Testament law. So we've got to continue down that track of thought with the covenant that God gave to Israel and how this would impact them as a nation. So we see in many cases these commandments that are actually stated to prevent evil from affecting Israel. And there's so many cases that we can read through these laws, and to us it just seems overly harsh. We think, who would ever come up with this? Why would God command that these people be put to death in this situation? It seems foreign to us, and frankly, it seems harsh to us. But is that really the design, or is there we'll say this in a bit of a fancy way, a theological foundation for this? And when I say that, I mean that the covenant that God gave to Israel and what they agreed to abide by really is the foundation for why these punishments are so severe and why evil is treated so severely. Because God in his word is clear that whenever you let evildoers get away with evil, when it's just a slap on the wrist, and it's not taken with any sort of seriousness, you end up with a situation where evildoers are emboldened and they do not stop committing evil, they continue down that same path. Now, that does not mean the punishment is the same in every situation. The law of God has different punishments depending on the severity of the crime, depending on what was done. There's a lot of details that have to go into it. Whether or not there were witnesses is one point that's very critical to understanding the laws that God gave to Israel. So we're not saying that there's a one-size-fits-all punishment and that everybody deserves the book to be thrown at them. That's not what the law teaches. But that is to say that the reason that God gave his law was to restrain evil. And as part of that, there's a covenant that undergirds all of this that provides those laws as well as the punishments that attend those who do not abide by them. So we've got to realize that is the core detail to why the law restrains evil. It's meant to protect Israel and to protect their holiness and to keep them in tune with God. Because if evil begins to spread freely, which, if you recall our study of the book of Judges when we talked about that in an overview fashion, evil was spreading throughout Israel without any sort of restraint. And it was because they cast off God's law. And remember, that was one of Israel's darkest periods, if not the darkest period of Israel's history. Because they had abandoned God's law, they threw off all restraint, they had committed themselves to doing evil. Now, going back to the law for just a moment here, and talking about how it's meant to restrain evil, I don't want to just say this in a general way. I want us to be clear with a couple examples that in some cases may trouble us. But there's some details we need to understand about them that hopefully will bring this together for us in a way we understand that there's a purpose behind it. So the first illustration is going to be about idol worshipers. I'm going to ask you to join me in Deuteronomy chapter 13, and we're going to read starting in verse 6 and go down to verse 11. So Deuteronomy chapter 13, starting with verse 6 and reading down to verse 11. And I want you to pay special attention to verse 11 when we get there, because again, this is going to speak to the reason why God gave a command like this. If your brother, the son of your mother, your son or your daughter, the wife of your bosom, or your friend who is as your own soul, secretly entices you, saying, Let us go and serve other gods, which you have not known, neither you nor your fathers, of the gods of the people which are all around you, near to you or far off from you, from one end of the earth to the other end of the earth, you shall not consent to him or listen to him, nor shall your eye pity him, nor shall you spare him or conceal him. But you shall surely kill him. Your hand shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people. And you shall stone him with stones until he dies, because he sought to entice you away from the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. So all Israel shall hear and fear, and not again do such wickedness as this among you. Now that passage, reading that from a 21st century perspective, that doesn't sound right. But I want you to really think carefully about the situation. Here is someone close to you, a family member. This person presumably understands the covenant that God has given. They realize the severity of that covenant, and they understand the consequences for breaching it. So that's kind of baked into this. I don't think that's unfair to say, given that this person is saying, let's go serve other gods, which implies they understand that this is not something that ought to be done, and they're doing this in secret. There's a level of intent here, is the point that I'm going for. So it's not as though this person is just innocently making a suggestion. This is something that is designed to bring people into a place they shouldn't be and to lead them astray. So we have to understand that in verse 6. That's really what's being talked about here. So what God is telling people who are put in that situation, don't go along with it. That's the first thing in verse 8. Don't consent to him, don't listen to him. But he also adds that this person is deserving of death. And the reason they're deserving of death is stated in verse 10. He sought to entice you away from who? The Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. That's the critical detail for understanding what's going on here and why this is so harsh. This is a person trying to lead someone astray from the true God, the one that had brought all the Israelites out of the house of bondage, preserved them to the point they entered the promised land, blessed them in abundance, and here someone is saying, you might want to go serve another God. Maybe we could do this together, and we'll do so in secret. We can understand why this would be such a troubling situation and why it is treated with such severity. Because if this were allowed to continue, or if this were to spread in some significant way, it's not going to be long before the entire nation is in jeopardy because of the actions of a handful of people. And that's not what was to be done, and that's not desirable. But then notice verse 11 as well as part of this conversation about restraining evil. All Israel shall hear and what? They shall hear and fear, and not again do such wickedness. This is meant to be a warning. Today someone might say that this person is being made an example of, and I suppose there's merit to that idea. But really, again, it goes back to the nation understanding this is not to be done, and it's to be treated with severity and with harshness. So yes, this does ring as a harsh matter to us, but again, we understand there's some details here that make this come together in a different way. It is meant to restrain the evil of idolatry, to keep paganism at bay from the Israelites, lest they go down the same road that all the other nations had. God did not want Israel to be like all the nations. He did not want them to be going after wood and stone as objects of worship. He wanted them to be unique, to be a light that was shining to all their neighbors of how great God is and how great he is to serve and what blessings he bestows upon them. But if they were to do something like what this person is suggesting back in verse 6, they weren't going to accomplish that. All they would do is prove they were no different, and that is not God's design for his people. So now going back to our slideshow for just a moment, how does this fit into what we're talking about how the law restrains evil? Because we see that in a situation where you're being persuaded and secretly enticed to pursue idols, it is to be treated with severity. It is to be treated as a major crime, because it is something that would lead Israel astray from their covenant obligations. Now, on that same token, and along those same lines, there's another passage that you may have read before, and perhaps you've heard before, and a lot of people love to cite this passage and talk about the brutality of the Bible. But we're going to see that that doesn't really hold up to examination, because that's not what this passage is talking about in the way it's commonly presented. We're going to go over to Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 18 through 21. And here in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 18 through 21, we have a passage that talks about how to handle a stubborn and rebellious child. Now, you'll notice a few details here right off the bat that we're going to talk about that may prove that the ideas that are usually presented about this are kind of flimsy. But let's read it for what it is, and then let's talk about it and how this example fits into our point about how the law restrains evil. If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and who, when they have chastened him, will not heed them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elder of his city, to the gate of his city. And they shall say to the elders of his city, This son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of his city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall put away the evil from among you, and all Israel shall hear and fear. Now let me ask you this question. Who is in view here as the one being punished? Is this a child? A young child? Notice verse 18. A stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother. He's been chastened and he will not heed them. He's been taken hold of in verse 19 and brought to the elders of the city. He is labeled as one that is stubborn and rebellious. He's a glutton and a drunkard. Now, I'm not sure about you, but I'm going to say that in this particular case, especially based on verse 20, this is not a child. This is not a young person in that respect. This is someone who is of a certain age to where they can make decisions, and they can choose to honor their father and their mother by the decisions they make. But this is not a young child. This is probably not even a teenager that's in view. This is an adult child that is bringing dishonor to his family by his conduct. And that is a completely different situation from how this is usually presented. But that aside, focus on what we're talking about with how the law restrains evil. So through this, we're seeing here that this is meant to, again, be an example to others who might follow in the footsteps of this insubordinate person. It is to put the evil away from Israel. It is meant to be a severe punishment, yes, but again, there's a purpose behind that severe punishment, because this person, by being a glutton and a drunkard, was jeopardizing his own family, he was jeopardizing his community, he was jeopardizing the whole nation. And we may not get that sense from this text, but again, if we put all the pieces together of what the law is doing, that's really what's going on here. And there's so many other cases where this fits in whenever we talk about how adultery is to be handled in chapter 22. We talk about how kidnappers are to be treated in chapter 24. There's so many examples we could cite that go along with this exact same thought, that the whole reason it's treated so harshly is to put the evil out from among the Israelites, to keep evil far away from them, to control that and to keep them from being overtaken by its consequences. This person was dangerous, stubborn and rebellious. Think about that. This is not a person who is honoring anyone, let alone himself or God. And here he's putting himself in a position where he's jeopardized his community and his family to the point that he is in jeopardy of being put to death because of his rebellion. Now, there's also some other things we could talk about that go along with this, but for right now, I think that suffices to accomplish our point, to say that the law is meant to restrain evil. And these two examples underscore what was going on and why that was the case, and the type of evil we're talking about. Because really, when we think about evil in the context of God's law, we're talking about what God declares to be evil, not what you or I might view as evil. Because we've got to make sure we understand that this is God's perspective on these issues, not man's perspective. And that modifies the whole situation. But I also want to mention something else that goes along with this, lest we come away with the wrong understanding about the severity of these laws. These are things that are being told well in advance. These are commandments that are given in advance of these situations ever occurring. Now, had these situations happened in history up to this point? Undoubtedly. There's no question. But the point that I'm making is that God is being very clear from the start of what his expectation is. He's being very clear from the outset of Israel's national history that this is his expectation. They cannot come along later and say, well, we didn't know you wanted us to do that. We didn't realize that was going to be so harsh. God is telling them before that situation ever even comes up, this is why this is to be done, and here's what you must do to handle the situation that arises. So you have no ambiguity. It's clear as day what the expectation is. And that in and of itself is a restraining force, because it helps Israel understand this is how serious God treats this issue. And that is meant to mean something to them in their own minds, and it also feeds into why they would want their children to understand the severity of God's law. They'd want them to be obedient to God's law. They themselves would want to be obedient to God's law, lest they fall into the hand of these punishments and end up in a situation they likely would not want to be in. So wrapping things up, I want us to make sure we put a nice bow on this conversation so we keep the idea of the big picture in mind. So we've seen some examples of how the law restrains evil. We understand the principle of why it needs to do that, but there's a bigger point to be made about all of this. The whole reason the law was seeking to restrain evil was to keep Israel holy before God so that in due time, the Messiah could come. Think about that for just a moment. When we talk about the Messiah, we're talking about Jesus Christ. The law was meant to keep Israel as a holy nation. Now, we understand from their history it was not always that way. They had their ups and their downs. But through it all, we see God preserving them and helping them, and we do see points where they did keep his law, and that did help them to become partially who he wanted them to be. And it would be through that that he would bring forth his son, Jesus Christ. And that's precisely why in the New Testament, in a place like Galatians chapter 3 and verse 24, the law is called a tutor. Older translations would use the word schoolmaster, but we use the word now tutor, which still doesn't capture the full meaning of what that's describing, but nevertheless, the point is, the law was a teacher to us. The law was a guide to us. It was never meant to be the guide itself. It was never meant to be the end-all be-all, but rather it was to bring us to the one who is the end-all be-all, and that is Christ Jesus. And so that's what that passage is teaching us. And so we see quite plainly that the Israelites were being taught by God through his law what it would mean to be holy and what it would mean to be close to him. And through that mechanism and the nation coming together underneath that law and under that covenant, it could create an environment where Jesus could come forth in God's own time. So the Israelites had a clear choice in all of this. They had a choice really from the beginning, if you want to be truthful about it. They had the choice to agree to his covenant. They had the choice to reject his covenant. It was their decision, and they knew what they were getting into. There's not a single Israelite that could honestly say, after hearing what God said and the law he set before them, well, I didn't understand that. Or, well, I didn't realize it was going to be that way. Because God was clear from the outset. And he's still clear to this very day. He's still clear about what his law is and what he expects from mankind. Now we understand the dynamic is different now in our day. Not because of anything that we have done, but because of Jesus Christ. We understand that we have a picture where we can reflect on things in a much more significant way than the Israelites could. They got a portion of things. They understood things to an extent, but they did not have the fullness of the gospel message revealed to them. They didn't have the same motivations necessarily that we do. So we realize that now we are in a different position than they were. So while God's law today that he has given to us through Christ is meant to restrain evil, we understand that it's really only because of Christ that that's possible to begin with. And each one of us individually has to wrestle with those laws and understand how we are to restrain evil within ourselves and how we are to become a holy people before God, subduing those passions and those evil desires that we have within us, lest they overtake us. And the punishments are a little bit different now, too. We understand that we're not doing the same things they did in the Old Testament as far as punishments go. But that's not to say there will be no punishment if we do not do what God wants us to do. We understand that Jesus repeatedly spoke of the punishment that would come to those who did not do God's will and did not do so for the right reasons and motivations. So we don't want to end up in that position either. So we realize that this principle still endures to this day. But now things have changed radically in a positive way because of Jesus. And now, where in the law we see this was possible but not to the fullest extent, now in Christ it most certainly is truly possible for us to restrain those evil desires and to become the people that God wants us to be. That goal is no longer something lofty that we can never attain. It is something we truly can attain only because of Jesus. So although the purpose is a little bit different now, God's law is slightly different in some respects than it was in the Old Testament, it still serves the purposes we've talked about. We still learn from his law given to us through Jesus what it means to be good and what it means to do good, and we also learn what is evil and why we ought to avoid it and the punishments that will come if we pursue it. But through all of that, it brings us back to Jesus Christ. It brings us back to his love and his concern and his teachings and why he wants us to be the way that he wants us to be. That's all we have to say for right now. We're going to continue this discussion a little bit later and have more to say about the Old Testament. As always, I thank you for your time and attention to this, and I hope it has been enlightening to you. Thank you.